Welcome to another conversation about practice development. I'm Jane Mills and this is
Karen Yates.
like the terrible twosome really, same act. Today Karen and I are going to have a chat about practice development and in particular in relation to your first assignment. So Karen.
Okay, Jane. So really, let's start at the beginning. What is practice development? Where does it come from?
Practice development is probably about 12 to 15 years old. So it really began in the United Kingdom and it was a way of nurses and nurse academics trying to create a cycle of improvement within clinical practice. And in many ways, it's tied to the idea of clinical governance in the United Kingdom. And there's a lot written about clinical governance in relation to those countries over there. So Brendan McCormack was really one of the initial nurse theorists that wrote about practice development. And in the textbook, he is the main author of Chapter 1. And he did a lot of work with a woman called Angie Titchen, and who's also contributed to the book, and another one called Kim Manley. So a lot of that work happened over in the United Kingdom. Over time, there was a slight sort of, I suppose like everything, the idea of practice development developed in itself. And so they came up with this framework called the Paris Framework, and that's the substance of Chapter 7 in the book. And that was led by then a young researcher who's now a very well-recognised professor of nursing, Jo Rycroft Malone. And so Jo's actually based in Wales and has been there for a long period of time. She's also the editor-in-chief of Worldviews on Evidence-Based Nursing. So Jo's always been really interested in the translation of research evidence into practice, and so really strengthened that aspect of practice development in her work. So there are a number of different theorists who write about practice development, and the main players are in the textbook for this semester.
So you talked about theorists that write about practice development. What do you mean by the theories?
Okay, so I suppose the theories are that this cycle really of practice development is something that nurse leaders, so they don't need to be like the nurse unit manager or the director of nursing, but nurse leaders within clinical practice on the floor, so to speak, but of course we know that floor is a very metaphorical idea. Yeah, well, it's a busy place, but it's also a bit metaphorical because you could be in a car out in the community as well. They can in actual fact lead a change in clinical practice that responds to an issue that they've identified so that it results in improved patient care. So a lot of it is around evidence translation and what we call evidence utilisation. So that's it's a really big issue that's well recognised in the literature, both in nursing and midwifery, that there are lots of people like us who are researchers that come up with really great research findings that never actually make it into clinical practice. So practice development is a way to actually affect that knowledge translation and evidence utilisation. It's very similar in many ways to the quality assurance cycle. So when we think about that whole process of identifying an issue or a problem, looking for the evidence that actually supports a change in practice to try and resolve an issue or problem, then implementing that change, evaluating it, and adjusting our intervention based on that. That's the same sorts of things that you do with a practice development plan. But the big key issue that Jo Rycroft Malone and Alison Kitson in particular talk about is this notion of facilitation. So they understand that practice development isn't something that one person can do. It's about actually creating a change in practice with the team that you're working with.
So that whole culture of the team.
Yeah. I think, and it's interesting you say that, I think culture is really instrumental in whether or not you can do effective change, do change. But Chapter 8 in particular talks about enablers and barriers that the workplace culture create in relation to effective practice development.
So for the first assessment for this subject, we're asking the students to discuss and appraise that theoretical basis or that underpinning of practice development. So how should they approach that assignment?
I think that the chapters that we've asked the students to read in the textbook provide a really good overview of the key theorists who are writing about practice development. So I would suggest that they begin there with the reading that we've prescribed, and then they look at the reference list for each one of those chapters and work backwards, really. The textbook was only published in April this year, which means that there will be very little literature out there that's newer than the textbook itself. So going to the reference list for each one of those chapters and picking out some relevant articles that catch their eye, that maybe expand on some of the theories, more so than is able to be captured in, say, a 5,000-word chapter, is probably a pretty good strategy to use.
And then we've asked them to look at some of the barriers and enablers. So they need to look at where they're working, their workplace.
Absolutely.
And identify what they think.
Typically, with our assignments, Karen and I like a practical assignment, we try and get students to do something that's applied and is useful, that they can actually take into the workplace and do something with. And so the idea with this is to get an understanding of practice development theoretically, and then think about, well, if I was going to write my plan, which many of the students are doing in this subject, taking up option 2 in the second assignment, if I'm going to write my plan, what are some of the barriers and enablers to actually putting that into place? And thinking about those early in the piece, right at the beginning, means that you can actually include those in the plan and put in place some, include those strategies, flesh them out, I suppose, in assignment 2.
That's good. So then once the students have identified those barriers, as you say, that will help them with assignment 2, and they can sort of work towards that. And if this conversation has cleared things up, that's great, that's our intent. But hopefully with the students participating in the meetings, they can always phone or email us if they've still got queries and they're not sure of the approach.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a little bit of input onto the discussion boards with people feeling all asunder with lots of new concepts and trying to understand new ideas. And that's really normal. And, I mean, research is also very similar, isn't it? A lot of the time you have to learn new terms and new ways of thinking about things. But the overall principles of practice development are very common in contemporary nursing and midwifery practice. So it's important that you get some sort of theoretical understanding of those and then think about, okay, well, that's the theory. Now, how can I actually use that in my own work?
Because that's our aim, isn't it? We want to have you have skills and information that you can take away and use in your own place of work.
Absolutely. So you're always welcome to give us a ring, and we're very happy to do one-on-one conversations, but also to have the group meetings. And I had my first 2 group meetings last night, and yours are tonight. And so hopefully it's going to clear up some issues for students. But in the meantime, any points of clarification, just send us an email, write on your group discussion board, on the big general discussion board, or give us a ring.
Great. Thanks for that.
No problem. Thanks, Karen. Bye, everybody.
Bye.